For 78 years, two flags have flown over one land, two anthems, two passports, two militaries that have fought 4 wars against each other, two nations that, on paper, have spent nearly 8 decades trying to prove they are nothing alike. And then scientists opened the DNA. They pulled genetic samples from across India and Pakistan, from Punjab to Sindh, from Kashmir to Karachi, from tribal villages in the Himalayan foothills to coastal communities along the Arabian Sea, and ran them through some of the most advanced population genetics tools available. They were looking for patterns, differences, evidence of the deep separation that a century of politics, religion, and war had supposedly carved into the people of this land. What they found instead was a result so unexpected that it forced an entire generation of geneticists to rewrite what they thought they understood about the subcontinent. Because underneath the borders, underneath the flags, underneath thousands of years of kingdoms rising and falling, the DNA of India and Pakistan tells a story that neither government on either side was fully prepared for. In the decades since, the two nations have built separate identities, separate national narratives, and in many cases, separate versions of the same shared history. But genetics does not follow national borders. It never has. Genes do not know about a Radcliffe line drawn hastily on a map in the summer of 1947. They do not know about visas or checkpoints or the barbed wire that now runs for nearly 2,000 miles between two of the most populous nations on Earth. What genes know is migration, marriage, birth, death. The slow, patient accumulation of biological history across thousands of generations long before either country existed in its current form. So when population geneticists finally set out to build a detailed genetic map of the subcontinent, comparing populations from across both India and Pakistan using genome-wide data, they weren't just running a routine scientific survey. They were testing an assumption that sits at the very foundation of two national identities. And what they discovered begins with a concept most people outside the field of genetics have never heard of: the ANI-ASI cline. In a landmark study published in 2009, a team of researchers led by geneticist David Reich analyzed DNA from dozens of ethnic groups across the subcontinent and reached a conclusion that reshaped South Asian population genetics almost overnight. Nearly every person living in India and Pakistan today, the study found, descends from a genetic mixture of two ancient ancestral populations. The first, known as ancestral North Indians, or ANI, carries deep genetic ties to populations in the Middle East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Europe. The second, known as ancestral South Indians, or ASI, is a far older lineage, native to the subcontinent itself, with no close genetic relatives found anywhere else in the world. Nearly everyone in both India and Pakistan, in other words, is a blend of these same two ancient populations, just in different proportions. And that single fact alone should have been a clue about what the deeper genetic story of the region would eventually reveal. A follow-up study, published in 2013 by researchers working alongside Reich's team, went even further. By analyzing genome-wide data from 73 separate groups across the subcontinent, the researchers were able to calculate roughly when this ancient mixing between ANI and ASI populations took place. Using a technique called linkage disequilibrium analysis, essentially measuring how genetic markers break apart and recombine over successive generations, they estimated that the admixture occurred somewhere between 1900 and 4200 years ago. That means the genetic blending that created the modern populations of both India and Pakistan happened long before either nation existed. Long before the Mughal Empire, long before the arrival of Islam in the region, long before the British Raj carved its administrative boundaries across the land. The shared ancestry at the heart of both populations was already in place thousands of years before anyone on the subcontinent had ever heard the words India or Pakistan. But the story gets even more specific and even more surprising once researchers began looking closely at exactly which populations sit where on this ancient genetic spectrum. When scientists plot South Asian populations along the ANI-ASI cline using principal component analysis, a striking pattern emerges. Populations from Pakistan and northwestern India, groups like the Balochi, the Pathan, and the Sindhi from Pakistan, alongside Punjabi Sikh Jats and Kashmiri Muslim populations from northwestern India, cluster tightly together at one end of the genetic spectrum, carrying the highest proportions of ANI ancestry found anywhere on the subcontinent. On the opposite end of that same spectrum sit Dravidian-speaking tribal groups from southern India, carrying deeper concentrations of the ancient ASI lineage. Read that again. Populations from Pakistan and populations from northwestern India, separated today by a heavily militarized international border, separated by different official languages, separated by different national identities, sit genetically closer to each other than either group sits to populations living hundreds of kilometers away within their own country's borders. A Sindhi farmer in Pakistan and a Punjabi Sikh in India may, in a very real genetic sense, be closer relatives to one another than either is to a Tamil-speaking family living in southern India, despite the fact that the Tamil family shares the same passport, the same national flag, and the same government as the Punjabi Sikh. This is not a fringe finding buried in an obscure paper. It has been confirmed, refined, and expanded upon by multiple independent research teams over the past decade, using different populations, different genetic markers, and different statistical methods. And the pattern holds every time. Researchers studying the genetic ancestry of populations from the historic Indus Valley region found something that adds even more weight to this picture. Communities living in the region, once occupied by the Indus Valley civilization, spanning parts of modern Pakistan and northwestern India, show a level of genetic continuity stretching back to the Bronze Age that has persisted for thousands of years, largely unbroken by the political and religious shifts that would come much later. One group in particular, known as the Roar community of northwestern India, was found by researchers to carry genetic signatures so closely tied to ancient populations from the Bronze Age steppe migrations that scientists now use this group as a genetic proxy for reconstructing what the ancient ancestral North Indian population may have actually looked like, genetically speaking. And that same ancient signal connects directly back to prehistoric individuals recovered from the Swat Valley, sitting today inside the borders of Pakistan. In plain terms, the ancient migrations that shape the deep genetic history of northern Pakistan are, quite literally, the same migrations that shape the deep genetic history of northwestern India. The Bronze Age did not stop at a border that would not exist for another 3,500 years. In 2019, that ancient continuity finally received direct physical confirmation. Archaeologists excavating a 5,000-year-old Indus Valley civilization burial site at Rakhigarhi in the modern Indian state of Haryana recovered skeletal remains well enough preserved to extract usable ancient DNA, a rare achievement in a region where hot, humid conditions typically destroy genetic material long before scientists ever get the chance to study it. When researchers finally sequenced the genome of this Indus Valley individual, the results lined up almost precisely with what the ANI-ASI model had predicted years earlier. The ancient individual carried ancestry linked to early Iranian agriculturalists, blended with a deep South Asian hunter-gatherer lineage, but notably lacked the later steppe-related genetic component that would arrive in the region during the Bronze Age migrations that followed. In other words, this 5,000-year-old skeleton, unearthed on Indian soil, represented an ancestral population that would go on to contribute genetic material to communities across both modern India and modern Pakistan. Thousands of years before either nation's borders were drawn, and thousands of years before the migrations that would later bring the ancestral North Indian genetic signature more fully into the picture. The Y chromosome record, passed down father to son, largely undisturbed across countless generations, tells a similar story of deep cross-border continuity. Researchers studying paternal lineages across the subcontinent have repeatedly found haplogroups such as R1A and J2 distributed widely across both Pakistani and Indian populations, particularly concentrated among groups in Punjab, Sindh, and the broader northwestern region on both sides of the border. These lineages trace back to ancient migration waves that moved through Central Asia and the Iranian plateau long before the categories of Indian or Pakistani existed in any meaningful sense. A Jat farmer in Pakistani Punjab and a Jat farmer in Indian Punjab today very often carry the same paternal haplogroup, inherited from common ancestors who lived on this land many centuries before partition, and in many cases, many centuries before the arrival of Islam in the region at all. The Kalash people of northern Pakistan add yet another fascinating thread to this story. Living in a handful of remote valleys near the Afghan border, the Kalash have long fascinated geneticists because of their unusually high proportion of West Eurasian ancestry compared to almost any other population in South Asia, a signature so distinct that researchers frequently use Kalash genetic data as a reference point when trying to model the deep ancestral components that shape populations across the entire subcontinent, in both Pakistan and India alike. Their isolation preserved a genetic snapshot of ancient migration patterns that most other communities, shaped by thousands of years of continuous mixing and regional movement, have long since blended into a more complex picture. In a very real sense, a small, remote community in the mountains of Pakistan has become one of the key genetic reference points for understanding the deep ancestry of hundreds of millions of people across the entire subcontinent, regardless of which side of the border they were born on. There's another layer to this story that researchers uncovered almost by accident while trying to understand something else entirely: the unusually high rate of certain inherited diseases found across specific communities in both India and Pakistan. In many other parts of the world, continuous intermarriage between different populations over thousands of years would have gradually blended ancient genetic signals into an undifferentiated genetic soup, making it far harder for modern scientists to trace deep ancestry with any precision. But because communities across both India and Pakistan have, for millennia, tended to marry largely within their own social and regional groups, the ancient genetic architecture laid down thousands of years ago has been preserved with remarkable clarity, like a fossil record written directly into the DNA of the living population, rather than buried in the ground. That same endogamy also explains something else that researchers found deeply significant. The genetic distance between many caste and community groups living within a single Indian state can, in some cases, be larger than the genetic distance between certain communities living on opposite sides of the India-Pakistan border. National identity, it turns out, has never been the primary force shaping the genetic structure of this region. Community, region, and ancient migration patterns have always mattered more. The story becomes even more layered when researchers turn their attention eastward to Bengal, a region split not once, but effectively twice across the 20th century. First, through the 1947 partition that divided Bengal between India and East Pakistan, and again in 1971, when East Pakistan broke away to become Bangladesh. Genetic studies of Bengali populations on both sides of these borders reveal a similarly deep continuity, with communities in West Bengal, India, and Bangladesh sharing ancestral genetic signatures that long predate any of the 20th century's political ruptures. The same pattern that scientists observed along the Punjab-Sindh corridor in the northwest repeats itself in the northeast. Political division carving through a population that remained, at the genetic level, remarkably continuous. Kashmir presents perhaps the most emotionally charged example of this same underlying pattern. Decades of conflict, military presence, and unresolved territorial dispute have made Kashmir one of the most politically fraught regions on the entire subcontinent. Yet genetic studies of Kashmiri populations consistently show close affinities with neighboring populations in both Punjab and northern Pakistan, reflecting a shared ancestral history that long predates the modern dispute over the region's political status. Geneticists studying the area are careful to note that this finding says nothing about how the territorial question should be resolved. That is a matter for diplomacy, history, and the people of the region themselves. But it does underscore, once again, that the genetic map of this land was never drawn along the same lines as its political map. Marriage records and oral family histories collected from partition-era migrants add a human dimension to what might otherwise remain an abstract statistical pattern. Genealogists working with families who migrated across the new border in 1947, Hindu and Sikh families moving from what became Pakistan into India, and Muslim families moving in the opposite direction, have documented countless cases of extended families being split by the new border almost overnight, with cousins, in-laws, and sometimes even siblings ending up as citizens of two different and increasingly hostile nations. These are not distant, abstract genetic relationships uncovered by a laboratory analysis decades later. In many cases, these are living memories, still held by grandparents and great-grandparents who can point to a specific village, a specific date, and a specific family member left on the other side of a border that, in 1947, was decided and drawn in a matter of weeks. The genetic continuity researchers have identified across the modern India-Pakistan border is not simply an ancient signal buried thousands of years in the past. In many families, it is also a living, remembered, deeply personal history, still only 2 or 3 generations removed. None of this is to say that India and Pakistan are genetically identical, or that meaningful population differences don't exist within and between both countries. They absolutely do. Researchers have identified at least 5 distinct ancestral genetic components across the broader Indian subcontinent, including additional ancestry linked to Tibeto-Burman populations in the northeast and Austroasiatic populations scattered across parts of central and eastern India. The genetic reality of South Asia has never been simple, and no single study captures its full complexity in one clean answer. But the central finding, and the one that keeps surfacing study after study, team after team, decade after decade, is this. The sharpest genetic divisions across the subcontinent do not run along the India-Pakistan border. They run along much older lines, shaped by geography, by ancient migration corridors, by thousands of years of regional community structure that existed long before 1947, and in most cases, long before any modern nation-state existed on this land at all. For scientists, none of this is really shocking. This is simply how human population genetics works almost everywhere on Earth. Political borders are, in the grand timeline of human history, astonishingly recent inventions. Genetic patterns, shaped by tens of thousands of years of migration, marriage, and regional settlement, move on a timescale that dwarfs the lifespan of any modern nation. But for millions of people raised on the idea that India and Pakistan represent 2 fundamentally separate peoples, That the border drawn in 1947 reflects some deeper ancient division between two distinct populations, the genetic evidence tells a very different story. It suggests that the line separating these two nations was drawn through a shared genetic landscape, not along the edge of one. It means a family in Lahore and a family in Amritsar, separated today by an international border, a visa process, and decades of political tension, may carry ancestral threads that are, in a very real biological sense, closer to one another than either family's ancestry is to communities living deep within their own country's interior. It means that the wedding customs, the food, the folk music, the dialects that shift only slightly as you cross from Amritsar to Lahore or from Jaipur to Karachi are not superficial coincidences of geography. They are, in many cases, the visible cultural surface of an ancestral population that has always shared far more than either national narrative tends to admit. Anyone who has spent time in both Punjab, India, and Punjab, Pakistan, has likely noticed how thin the cultural line can feel in daily life, even as the political line remains one of the most heavily guarded borders on the planet. The genetic data simply gives that lived observation a scientific foundation. It means the ancient farmers, herders, and traders who moved across the Indus Valley more than 4,000 years ago, long before Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, or Sikhism existed in the forms we recognize today, left a genetic fingerprint that modern political history simply was never able to erase. That is the result that shocked researchers when the data finally came back. Not that India and Pakistan were different. Everyone expected some degree of difference. What surprised the scientific community was how consistently the deepest genetic connections crossed the modern border rather than respecting it. How a Pashtun in Peshawar could share more ancestral DNA with a Kashmiri in Srinagar than either shares with communities just a few hundred kilometers further into their own national territory. This growing body of evidence has not gone unnoticed by the governments of either country. In recent years, India has invested heavily in large-scale genome sequencing initiatives aimed at building a more complete genetic reference map of its own population, partly driven by the recognition that global genetic databases, built overwhelmingly from European samples, have long underrepresented South Asian genetic diversity in ways that directly affect medical research and drug development for the region's 7 billion combined people. Pakistan, too, has seen a growing number of research collaborations focused on cataloging the genetic diversity of its own population, from the mountainous north to the coastal south. Neither government has publicly framed these projects around the shared ancestry findings this documentary has just walked through. The political sensitivity of that framing is, understandably, immense. But the underlying scientific data these projects continue to generate keeps reinforcing the same pattern that researchers first identified more than a decade ago. It's worth pausing here to be precise about what this evidence does and does not claim. It does not erase the very real cultural, religious, linguistic, and historical differences that exist between communities across India and Pakistan, differences that are just as real and just as meaningful as the shared genetic ancestry underlying them. Culture is not a footnote to biology, and lived identity is not something a DNA test can override or invalidate. A person's language, faith, family history, and national identity remain entirely their own, regardless of what a genetic analysis says about ancestry dating back thousands of years. What the science does show is narrower and in some ways more interesting. That the assumption of two cleanly separated ancestral populations mirroring the modern political border simply does not hold up against the genetic record. The border is real. The political history behind it is real and consequential, and still shapes the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people. But it was never, genetically speaking, a line drawn between two separate peoples. It was a line drawn through one. Researchers who work in this field are often asked, understandably, whether findings like these could ever influence public attitudes on either side of the border. Most are cautious about overstating the case. Genetic ancestry has never been a reliable predictor of how people feel about one another, and history is full of examples. From the Balkans to the Korean Peninsula to Rwanda, where deep shared ancestry did nothing to prevent political division, and in some tragic cases, did nothing to prevent violence between genetically close populations. Shared DNA has never been a guarantee of shared peace. But what these studies do offer is something quieter and perhaps more durable than a headline, a factual record built independently by multiple research teams over more than a decade, that the deep ancestral story of this land was never as simple as the modern map suggests. Science does not exist to settle political arguments, and no single genetic study can, or should, be used to resolve questions that belong to history, diplomacy, and the lived experience of hundreds of millions of people on both sides of a very real and very consequential border. But science can do something else. It can hold up a mirror to assumptions that have gone unquestioned for generations, and ask a simple, honest question. Is the story we've been telling ourselves actually the story our own biology tells? Perhaps the most fitting way to end this story is with the observation researchers. themselves keep returning to, study after study, decade after decade. The border between India and Pakistan is one of the most consequential lines ever drawn on a map, shaping the lives, deaths, and futures of well over 1.5 billion people combined. But it was drawn in 1947 by committee over a matter of weeks, using maps that were often outdated and information that was often incomplete. The genetic history of this land was written far more slowly and far more patiently over thousands of years of migration, marriage, and settlement, a process no committee could have replicated and no border could fully undo. For India and Pakistan, the DNA has already given its answer. Whether that answer changes anything about how either nation sees itself or the other is a question no laboratory can settle. That question belongs to the people living on both sides of the border, the DNA never fully recognized in the first place.